For more on this story, let's bring in Guillaume Lang now, Senior Fellow at the Centre for Economic and Policy Research and former Ecuadorian Foreign Minister. Thank you so much for joining us on France 24, Guillaume. The US has framed this as a capture and arrest. You could argue it's an abduction. How would you describe the US's operation?
Well, it's a very blatant illegal act and violation of international law. I think it's one of the most flagrant examples of a violation of international law of the last few years, really. It violates Article 2, of course, of the UN Charter, and it violates pretty much every single article of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. This is not an act of self-defense. There was no aggression of the US, and it's not sanctioned or authorized, if you prefer, by the UN Security Council. So it is going to be seen by the international community as a legal airstrike and as an illegal, you use the word abduction, I think that's the right word, or maybe kidnapping of a standing head of state. We'll have to see what the reaction of the international community is. We've already seen that the Venezuelan foreign minister is asking for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, but I imagine there's going to be some very forceful reactions. Unfortunately, we've already seen a reaction from the European Union, Mrs. Callas and Mrs. von der Leyen, who have not been very forceful and who have not denounced this. So that's a source for concern, I think, for Europe. But I imagine we'll see more forceful reactions on behalf of other states. It's also important to note that the special envoy of Chinese President Xi Jinping had arrived in Venezuela yesterday. It's unclear whether this Chinese special envoy was still on Venezuelan territory when the US airstrike happens. But if it did, I can imagine that will be seen as a very threatening move on behalf of China. But I imagine there'll be all sorts of other reactions that we're going to see unfold over the next few hours.
You're calling this an illegal strike under international law. What legal basis is the US likely to use to justify this operation?
Well, so far we've seen no legal argument being presented by the United States. It's all sort of discourse for domestic politics, really. It's all about accusing Venezuela of being involved in narco trafficking. The expert community on these issues, including narco trafficking, disagrees with the US administration on this. There is, of course, some drugs which have been transiting through Venezuela, mostly obviously coming from Colombia, which is still the largest cocaine producer in the world. But most experts agree that it's between 5 to 8% of Colombian cocaine goes via Venezuela. The bulk of Colombian cocaine is not going via Venezuela. In fact, it's going southwards from Venezuela into countries like Ecuador and Peru. And probably 70 to 80% of that cocaine is then leaving those ports on the Pacific coast of Latin America, so that's not Venezuela, in order to reach Europe primarily, because Europe is a bigger customer for Colombian cocaine, and then the United States secondly. So the narco trafficking argument is essentially, I would say, a political argument for domestic audiences, but it's not a serious one, and it's certainly not one that has any legal grounding or force, because, of course, you do not invade countries because of narco trafficking, and you do not bomb or do not do extrajudicial killings, which is what we've seen at sea over narco trafficking. So I think this is mostly for domestic audiences and mostly for US domestic politics. It will play a big role. We saw it in your own coverage of the news in Florida, where Marco Rubio is from, the Secretary of State. And we know that Venezuela was a subject dear to Marco Rubio's heart. I think Marco Rubio sees Venezuela and Cuba, where his family is originally from, as very interconnected issues. And I think he sees the road to Havana going via Caracas. So I think the issue has to be seen more as a domestic politics issue in the United States, including obviously the politics of the state of Florida.
Venezuela, you mentioned, has called for a Security Council meeting. What's likely to happen there? What can happen there?
It's difficult to know for now, but there are going to be a number of voices in the UN Security Council that are going to be denouncing the US's unilateral and illegal actions. Obviously, I think we'll get some strong responses from China and from Russia. Russia's already responded in forceful terms. It'll be more interesting maybe to see what the response from other Global South countries is, including neighboring Colombia, which is currently on the UN Security Council, but also from European states, including UN permanent UN Security Council permanent countries such as France, crucially, and the United Kingdom. So we'll have to see what their reaction is. One would hope that their reaction would be a strong condemnation of these illegal actions. But so far, again, as I've just said, European spokesperson, High Commissioner Callas, has not condemned the actions. So we'll have to see what UN member states, European Union member states such as France, for example, actually say at the UN Security Council meeting.
And Guillaume, there were a lot of questions already around the legality of the US's interventions in the Caribbean when they were striking boats accused of trafficking drugs to the US. So would you say it's fair to say that Trump has reached a new level of unrestrained global power with this new operation?
This is the first time in over a century that the United States militarily attacks a South American state. There have been military interventions on behalf of the United States in the Caribbean, in Latin America, but never on South American soil. The last significant US attack and occupation of Latin American states was Panama, but that's a much smaller country. Back in 1989, 1990, when the US occupied Panama, it was a country with 2.5 million inhabitants. Venezuela is a much larger country. We're talking about of 28 million inhabitants, again, and in a region that hasn't been attacked by the United States. Of course, the United States has intervened in covert actions, supported military coups throughout the Cold War and military dictatorships throughout the Cold War, but never bombed South American countries, at least not in the last over a century. So I think this really, yes, is a historic moment. It really marks, I think, the Trump administration's reassertion of US power in the Western Hemisphere. There's been a lot of talk of the Trump administration's reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine and the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Yeah, it really sends a signal that the US wants to dominate the Western Hemisphere. It is doing it militarily. So far, the United States is failing to do so economically, with most South American countries having stronger trade ties, for example, with China than with the United States. So it's kind of like use of a big stick rather than the use of a carrot, if you like, in the region. It's US flexing its military muscle. We'll have to see what the long-term consequences are of that. But I think, today marks a historic day, and there's going to be a lot of lessons learned by South Americans in terms of how they must deal with this threat of the United States just being able to bomb a South American country like that. We're seeing reactions. Lula has reacted, Brazilian president has reacted strongly. We've also seen the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, react strongly. We'll have to see how other Latin American states react. But I think historically, yes, it's very significant, and it marks a new chapter in the US dominance of the Western Hemisphere.
Guillaume Lang, thank you so much for speaking to France 24.